Welcome to News for the Food Lover. My name is Dane Richards. I'm the publisher and chief judge at News for the Food Lover, and I've got the pleasure today of having Brian Steele and Jeremy Rowland with me. It's always good to catch up with these gentlemen, and with COVID, it's prevented that over the last year, but now things have eased up. We thought it's a great opportunity to talk about things that are happening in the food world, how COVID's affected the landscape, and talk about the art and craft of food criticism. During COVID, obviously, you were restricted to where you live in Brisbane. Brian and I are Sydney-based, and even Brian and I couldn't travel as we normally would to Melbourne and other states. But what did you observe in Brisbane during COVID, as far as the industry? I mean, is there any insights you took out of that?
Well, Brisbane being in Queensland, we were probably a little bit luckier than the southern states in that, well, a lot of people complained at one stage, but the borders were closed and we had very minimal COVID transmission, and we've been lucky enough to, quite honestly, have a relatively normal existence. So things were closed down to some extent, but they reopened much quicker than they did in Melbourne and Sydney. And I think we've only had one total lockdown since things have reopened. So whilst things weren't normal, things started coming back slowly, and certainly for takeout and for home delivery we kept going, and then the biggest challenge was social distancing. So restaurants that normally set 100 people could only sit 20, which generally isn't economical, but they found different ways around that. And I think the main observation is that, again, the restaurant industry is fairly resilient. They found ways to stay alive, and they did.
Brian touched about the industry pivoting, which it did, and it did particularly well. Reviewing post-COVID and the context of how we critique restaurants, because the industry, we saw all sorts of divergences into set menus and to different offering of the experiences, but just basically due to the 4 square and 2 square metre rules that were imposed at that time. But how do you see food reviewing, food critique going forward post-COVID, or even in this transition period, because we're not fully out of it and we haven't defined what the new normal is yet? But
I think it's just a little dependent on the market, obviously, and my view of what's happening in the market is we're getting a lot more convergence, casualisation, so the top-end diners are coming down to the middle, and quite a few of the cafes are going back up into the middle, so there's a lot of activity in that middle market. There will always be a place for fine dining, but I think there's going to be a little less of the fine diners and a lot more of the more casual bistros, and even things with the fixed menus, the table-to-host, price fixed menus are coming back. Which I don't necessarily think is a bad thing, because it allows people to know what they're doing, and it also, from a chef's point of view, it's much more economical. They don't have the waste factors. So I think we'll see a change in the way food is presented, so that from a reviewing point of view, we're going to have a different animal to review, if you like. So it's going to be a little bit more casual, a little bit more friendly. So I think the reviews need to be the same. And I think over the last 12 months or so, we've all learnt to come together, and I think that will continue to a degree. I think there are a number of things that might stay, or for a little while, such as having to register when you go into a restaurant, a degree of social distancing, which, again, I don't necessarily think is a bad thing. I think there were a few restaurants, certainly in Brisbane, where the tables were too close prior to COVID. So, look, I think things will come back. It'll be different. And as the restaurants will be different, reviewing will be a little bit different, but it's not going to go away. People want to know what's available. They want an element of third-party recommendation. The professional reviewers are probably a bit more reliable than some of the others, and they have a place in providing that information for people to make a decision on where to go.
Very interesting point you mentioned there about, I think, diner expectations changed, and how diners are even connecting with the restaurants, and I think we do have to flex and pivot our own styles to that too, because what the diners want from us has changed as well. And I mean, as you said, the move towards a more fine casual sort of experience, and that's a category we're introducing to differentiate between the fine dining restaurants and this emergence of this fine casual sort of segment. But Brian, your thoughts on reviewing post-COVID?
Well, I think it's important to understand who leads. Okay, it's the customer that leads.
Yeah.
So, as a restaurant critic, you don't decide what the new trend is going to be, and despite a chef wanting to, the chef doesn't decide. Just like the curse of the the signature dish. Chefs don't get to choose that, and sometimes it becomes the thing that irritates them the most, because it's the thing they can't take off the menu and they want it. But the customer wants it, and the chefs are cooking for the customer. So what happens next? Well, look, I mean, if you take the aphorism, the best way to predict the future is look to the past. COVID is an event not dissimilar to any of the previous number of nouvelle cuisine events that were a basis for change. The most famous, which wasn't even the first, but where chefs started to move away from all of the core dishes that were codified by Escoffier in the early 1900s. They wanted more flexibility and they wanted more control. And they wanted to be able to be creative in their own right, rather than go, this is how you do this, and this is the only way you do this. And so what we've now come through, and Jeremy alluded to it, is something that has possibly helped restaurateurs understand what flexibility they have in moving into different spaces within the restaurant world, and understanding that some of the perceived norms and the perceived essential parts of a restaurant aren't that essential after all. So think about all the classics, like, do you need tablecloths? Do you need multiple exotic plates? Do you have to have elements of what's called fine dining or otherwise? It's actually, I think where we're moving to is just evolving as cuisine always has, which is led by the customer, and where the chef pays attention to what people enjoy and what they feed back on. And people like us as restaurant critics, we need to make sure that we are also, agile to the point that, and I alluded to this previously when I talked about restaurant criticism, is that when you walk into a restaurant, it's not relevant what category it decides you've decided it's going to be. It's not about whether it's a fine diner or a cafe or a bistro. It's, are they doing what they say they're doing? Yeah.
John Newton had that famous saying. It's very true.
And so you then use that as the basis to then understand and basically judge them against what they say they are doing. And so and if you think about it, coming back to what we do as critics, I remember looking into this when I was doing my research in scoring systems are really interesting, and you and I have discussed this before. Ideally, and it's hard to maintain, but take the Gourmillot Guide, take the Michelin Guide. If you have a scoring system, every genre of restaurant should have its own scoring system. Even if it's a case of a cafe gets scored out of 10, a bistro gets scored out of 15, and a fine diner gets scored out of 20. But you need to have be able to give the customers the information they need, which is do you want to spend your money here, by using, as Jeremy said, a nice story, some elegant prose and evocative phraseology that helps you describe to the customer what to expect at that restaurant, but also it's on us to describe what that restaurant is doing, and then give people the ability to make that decision based on both the scoring system and if they try to read it. So I think nothing massive is going to change, but it's restaurants are evolving as they always have. The customer is more educated and more nuanced than they've ever been. And the world is a global village, and so ingredients and techniques and media from YouTube and everything else means that every city is possible, every city on the planet now, to have every type of cuisine done well. And so you can then start having wonderful, discussions about things like authenticity and techno-emotional cuisine and all that sort of stuff. But the point is, the customer leads. And the chefs, they're the smart ones don't care about restaurant critics. They care about the customer.
And I think, as you say, the customer leads, and it is about the customer, and what trends we're going to see will be dictated by the customer.
Absolutely.
When we're all stressed and tied up, we tend to go back to comfort food.
Absolutely.
So there's a trend towards that. But the other thing is the customers, our customers, who haven't been able to go out to restaurants for maybe 6 months or more, they learned to cook at home.
They've been making a lot of
And
bread.
they've been making a lot of sourdough, they've been making a lot of pickles, they've found all sorts of things, but they have learnt more and they have become more sophisticated.
Absolutely.
And they're not going to put up with mediocre.
No.
So whether it's a cafe or a fine diner or even a fast food chain, they're not going to put up with poor quality. And people will go, you know, if you can deliver good quality, and that's what basically the requirement of a critic is, to highlight the ones that do deliver high quality, then there's going to be quite a bit of growth forward. But there will be a lot of changes, and we have to manage with that.
There's always those basic tenements that underpin a restaurant experience, and yeah, you're right, the new normal's not an excuse to let some of those go. So people will interpret those in different ways, and a restaurant will represent those in different ways.